The question hung in the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of the office, as sharp and cold as a scalpel. "Did you administer any medication that was not charted?" Sarah Jenkins felt the words pressed down on her, the weight of them settling in her chest. She kept her hands clasped in her lap, forcing the tremor in her fingers to still. Across the polished mahogany desk sat Karen Vance, the head of risk management for Northgate Public Hospital. Everything about Vance was sharp. Her tailored blazer, her predatory smile, the glint of her glasses under the fluorescent lights. To her, this wasn't about a patient. It was about a number that didn't add up, a variable that had appeared on a spreadsheet where it didn't belong. "I followed Dr. Finch's orders," Sarah said, her own voice sounding distant, detached. It was a lie, a black stone of a lie that she swallowed down, lodging itself next to the fear. Vance leaned forward, the smile tightening. "I see. The patient's pain score went from a consistent 10 to a 2 overnight. That doesn't happen with a simple saline drip and wishful thinking, Nurse Jenkins. It happens with powerful, unsanctioned pharmaceuticals." She steepled her fingers, her gaze unwavering. "We will be running a full toxicology screen on the patient just to ensure there are no inconsistencies. We can't have unaccounted for variables in patient care. It's a legal minefield." A legal minefield. That's what he was to her. Not a person, not a soul in agony, but a potential lawsuit. Sarah thought of the man in the bed at the far end of the ward, the one they called John Doe. She thought of the way the deep lines of pain around his eyes had finally softened, the way he had slept for 6 straight hours for the first time in weeks, the way he had looked at her, his cynical, world-weary eyes holding a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Peace, and that peace was her crime. 3 days earlier, the end of the hall at Northgate Public was a forgotten territory. It was where the ward's official capacity gave way to its grim reality, a liminal space for overflow, for the hopeless, for the dying who had the misfortune of doing so without insurance. The linoleum floors were a roadmap of scuffs and stains, each one a story of hurried feet and spilled fluids. The air, a constant, tired hum of aging machinery and antiseptic, seemed heavier here. And here, in the last bed, lay John Doe. He was a monument to suffering. Pancreatic cancer, a notoriously cruel disease, had whittled him down to little more than bone and taut, jaundiced skin. He'd been brought in by an ambulance 2 weeks prior, found collapsed in an alley, with no identification to give him a past and no family to give him a future. He was a ghost in the system, a chart number assigned to a body waiting to expire. Sarah Jenkins, at 28, had been a nurse for 5 years, long enough to grow a callus over the softest parts of her heart, but not thick enough to block out everything. She saw the other nurses, like her friend Maria Rodriguez, who moved with a brisk, professional detachment. Maria was a good nurse, efficient and skilled, but she had learned the art of emotional self-preservation. "You can't carry them all, Sarah," she'd say over stale coffee in the break room. "This place, these stories, they'll eat you alive if you let them." Sarah would nod, but she couldn't make herself believe it. She couldn't unsee the flicker of the person still trapped inside the patient. With John Doe, it was in his eyes. When he was lucid, between the gut-wrenching waves of pain that made his whole body go rigid, his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a cynical fire that hadn't been extinguished yet. He'd refuse care with a dismissive wave of a skeletal hand, a silent, "Leave me to die in peace," though there was no peace to be found. The hospital's protocol for uninsured terminal patients was a cruel joke. A standard-issue morphine drip, the dose capped at a level that Dr. Alistair Finch, the attending physician, deemed fiscally responsible. It barely touched John's agony. On his chart, Sarah's neat handwriting recorded the same number, day after day. Pain, 10-10. She had approached Dr. Finch that morning, catching him as he did his whirlwind rounds, his attention divided between his tablet and the half-dozen residents trailing him. He was a brilliant diagnostician with the bedside manner of a parking enforcement officer. "Dr. Finch, John Doe's pain is still uncontrolled," she began, her voice steady despite the knot of frustration in her stomach. "The morphine isn't enough. His vitals are showing the stress. Can we please consider a palliative care consult or maybe a fentanyl patch? Anything." Finch didn't break his stride. He swiped a finger across his tablet. Nurse Jenkins, the patient is uninsured and undocumented. The hospital formulary is clear, and it exists for a reason. We are providing the standard of care. Upping his opiate dosage would risk respiratory depression, which would lead to a cascade of interventions that the hospital will not be compensated for. He finally glanced at her, his eyes devoid of warmth. He's terminal. We are managing his decline, not running a 5-star hotel. Let the medicine do its work. He swept away, his gaggle of residents in tow, leaving Sarah standing in the hallway, his words echoing in the air. Managing his decline. It was such a sterile, inhuman phrase for watching a man be tortured to death. Rage, cold and helpless, coiled in her gut. She looked toward the end of the hall, toward the man whose only crime was to be sick and poor, and felt the ghost of another man's pain rise up to meet her. Her father's. That evening, her small, quiet apartment felt like a sanctuary. It was the only place the scent of antiseptic couldn't reach. On the mantelpiece, a photograph smiled out at her. A younger Sarah, beaming, her arm linked with her father's. He looked healthy in the picture, his eyes full of life before the same disease that was consuming John Doe had come for him. Her father, Robert Jenkins, had been a history teacher, a man of quiet strength and endless curiosity. He had good insurance, he had a family, he had every resource modern medicine could offer. And still, the cancer had been brutal. Sarah remembered the nights spent by his bedside, listening to the ragged breaths that were punctuated by moans of pain. The breakthrough had come in his final months, a small, translucent patch that his oncologist had prescribed. A high-cost, new-generation fentanyl patch that delivered a steady, powerful stream of relief. The patch had given him back his dignity. It had quieted the screaming agony in his body, allowing him to spend his last weeks not as a vessel of pain, but as himself. He'd told stories, cracked jokes, held his wife's hand, and said his goodbyes. The patch had given them that. It had given her that. He'd been gone 6 months now. Driven by an impulse she didn't try to name, Sarah walked to the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. She had cleaned out most of his prescriptions, returning them to the pharmacy as instructed. But one box she couldn't bring herself to touch. It sat in the back, a final sealed relic of his fight. Fentanyl transdermal system. 100 Mahar mcg hour. The label bore his name in stark black letters, Robert Jenkins. Her hands shook as she picked up the box. Maria's voice was a whisper in her head. You'll burn out. You can't save them all. But then she saw John Doe's face, his eyes clenched shut, his knuckles white as he gripped the bed railing. She saw Dr. Finch's dismissive sneer. She saw a system that would allow a man to suffer needlessly because he didn't have the right paperwork. With a shuddering breath that felt like a prayer and a transgression all at once, she broke the seal and took out one of the small, square patches. It felt heavy in her palm, weighted with the full force of her grief, her anger, and a desperate, defiant act of compassion. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered to the photograph on the mantel, but I think you'd understand. The hospital was a different world in the pre-dawn hours. The usual cacophony softened to a hush, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. It was a time of quiet desperation and sleeping fears. Sarah moved through the dim ward like a phantom, her heart hammering against her ribs. John Doe was awake. He stared at the water-stained ceiling tiles as if trying to decipher a map. His body was a rigid line of tension under the thin hospital blanket. Go away, he rasped, without turning his head. Nothing you can do. Sarah pulled the privacy curtain, encasing them in a small, private world. I know, she said softly. The system is broken. It's designed to manage your decline. She used Finch's words, and they tasted like ash in her mouth. But I can't just stand by. I can't watch. She held out her hand, the small patch resting in her palm. This is off the record, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's not from the hospital. It's not from a doctor's order. It's from me. He slowly turned his head, his eyes, clouded with pain, focused first on the patch, then on her face. For a long moment, he just looked at her, suspicion and a deep, profound weariness warring in his gaze. The world had taught him that nothing came for free, that kindness was a currency he couldn't afford. Why? His voice was a dry crackle. Sarah's throat tightened. Because no one should have to feel like that, she said, the words catching. Because my father, he had the same fight. He deserved dignity at the end. So do you. The cynical armor that had protected him for so long, finally, infinitesimally, cracked. He didn't have the strength for a full nod, but she saw the consent in his eyes, a flicker of surrender, not to the pain, but to her. With gentle, practiced hands, she cleaned a small area on his upper arm, the alcohol swab cool against his feverish skin. She peeled the backing off the patch and pressed it firmly into place. The act was intimate, secret, a shared conspiracy against the indifferent world. It was also a felony. As she pulled the blanket back over him, his hand moved, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes already starting to drift closed. Sarah stood there for a long moment, watching him, the knot of fear in her stomach now tangled with a fierce, protective sense of rightness. She had crossed a line, and she knew she could never go back. The change over the next 48 hours was nothing short of miraculous. When Sarah arrived for her next shift, the tormented rigidity was gone from John's body. He was sleeping, a deep, peaceful slumber that was more restorative than any medicine the hospital could offer. When he awoke, he was lucid. The fire was back in his eyes, but this time it wasn't fueled by pain, it was curiosity. He asked for water, and his voice was stronger. He even managed a weak, dry joke about the green Jell-O on his lunch tray, calling it industrial waste. Sarah found herself smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She started spending her breaks in his room, not as a nurse, but as a visitor. He didn't talk about his past. It was a locked door he kept bolted. But he talked about other things. He commented on the changing autumn light outside the window, debated the literary merits of the tattered copy of Moby Dick someone had left in the common room, and asked about her. He was sharp, observant, with a mind that had clearly not gone to waste, even if his body had. She told him about her dream of getting her nurse practitioner license, of being able to do more, to make more decisions. "You'd be good at it," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "You listen." He never asked about the patch. He never mentioned the miracle that had quieted his pain. It was their silent covenant. But miracles in a place like Northgate Public draw attention. Maria noticed immediately. Wow, Doe is a new man. What did Finch finally put him on? I guess the morphine finally built up in his system, Sarah lied, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. Even Dr. Finch, on his perfunctory rounds, was forced to acknowledge the change. He glanced at the chart, saw the dramatically lowered pain scores, and nodded with a look of smug self-satisfaction. "See, Nurse Jenkins?" he said, tapping his tablet. "Patience. Sometimes you just have to trust the protocol and let the medicine do its work." The irony was so thick, Sarah felt she could choke on it. The medicine doing its work wasn't his, it was her father's. The protocol being followed wasn't the hospital's. It was the simple human protocol of compassion. A knot of anxiety, cold and hard, began to tighten in her stomach. She was getting away with it, but for how long? The answer came in the form of Karen Vance. And so she sat in the sterile office, the question of the uncharted medication hanging between them, her lie exposed before it was even fully told. The toxicology screen would reveal everything. It would give Vance the proof she needed to turn this act of mercy into a case file, a liability report. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's aggressive air conditioning. She had eased one man's suffering, only to invite a world of it upon herself. The days following her suspension were a blur of shame and suffocating anxiety. Being escorted out of the hospital by a security guard, her personal effects in a cardboard box, was a particular kind of humiliation. She saw the looks from her former colleagues, pity from some, fear from others, a cold judgment from a few. Maria had given her a quick, desperate hug by the elevators, whispering, "Call me. Don't talk to anyone." Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The suspension notice from the hospital sat on her kitchen table, a crisp, white harbinger of doom. It was soon joined by a certified letter from the State Board of Nursing, informing her that she was under official investigation for professional misconduct and the illegal diversion of a controlled substance. Then came the knock on the door. Two men in plain clothes stood in the hallway. They introduced themselves as detectives. The older one, Detective Miller, had a weary face and kind eyes that seemed out of place on a man who dealt with the city's underbelly. His younger partner was all sharp angles and suspicion. "Miss Jenkins," Miller began, his voice calm and even. "We're investigating an incident at Northgate Public. We'd like to ask you a few questions." She let them in, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had spent an hour on the phone with a legal aid lawyer whose name she'd gotten from Maria. His advice was simple and terrifying: say as little as possible. They sat at her kitchen table, the official notices forming a grim centerpiece between them. Miller laid it out plainly. The toxicology report had come back from the hospital lab. It showed a high concentration of a specific fentanyl metabolite, one that was not in John Doe's chart and did not match the hospital's formulary. A little more digging, and they had cross-referenced prescriptions. They knew about her father. "We know the patch was prescribed to your late father, Robert Jenkins," Miller said, his gaze more curious than accusatory. "We're not trying to jam you up here, Miss Jenkins. We're just trying to understand what happened. Why you did it." Sarah looked at their faces. She thought of the cold fury of Dr. Finch, the reptilian smile of Karen Vance. She thought of John Doe, finally sleeping without pain. "I saw a man in agony," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The kind of agony I wouldn't wish on anyone. I'm a nurse. My job is to help people. So I helped him." The younger detective scoffed. "By committing a felony? By practicing medicine without a license? You could have killed him with an improper dose." "The hospital was already killing him," Sarah shot back, a flash of her earlier anger returning. "They were just doing it slowly and legally." Miller held up a hand, silencing his partner. He looked at Sarah for a long moment. "You're facing serious charges," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Unlawful distribution of a Schedule II controlled substance. You need to understand that. For now, we're just gathering facts, but I'd advise you not to leave the state." After they left, Sarah sank into a chair, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow and trembling. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name, a case number. It had walked into her home. Meanwhile, a different kind of authority was in motion. In the state capitol, Governor Marcus Donovan sat in his sprawling, mahogany-paneled office, the seal of the state gleaming on the wall behind him. He was the image of power, a tailored suit, a confident smile, a man accustomed to shaping the world to his will. He was deep in a heated discussion about an upcoming infrastructure bill when his chief of staff quietly interrupted. "Governor, line 2, it's Mr. Abernathy." Marcus's posture changed instantly. The politician vanished, replaced by a man holding his breath. Abernathy was the private investigator he'd had on a quiet, personal retainer for over a decade. There was only one reason Abernathy would ever call him directly on this line. He took the call in his private study. "What is it?" "Governor," the investigator's voice crackled over the phone. "After all this time, I think we found him. I think we found Michael." The world tilted. Michael. Mikey, his younger brother. The free-spirited, tempestuous artist who had been the wild, bright flame to Marcus's cool, calculated ambition. The brother who had accused him of selling his soul for power during a vicious, final argument over their father's estate. The brother who had walked out of his life 15 years ago and vanished into the wind, leaving behind only a gaping hole of guilt and unanswered questions. "Where?" Marcus breathed, his hand gripping the receiver. "It's not good, sir," Abernathy said gently. "He was admitted to a hospital 2 weeks ago, in Northgate. He came in as a John Doe. He's listed in critical condition. Terminal." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Terminal. He had imagined finding his brother 1,000 times, in 1,000 different scenarios. An angry confrontation, a tearful reunion, an awkward coffee. He had never, not once, imagined this. "Which hospital?" he asked, his voice raw. Northgate Public. The name meant nothing to him. Governor Donovan canceled his afternoon. He told his staff there was a family emergency. He called his wife Jessica, her gasp on the other end of the line a mirror of the shock that was ricocheting through him. The infrastructure bill, the political squabbles, the entire edifice of his public life crumbled away, leaving only one stark imperative. He had to get to Northgate. He had to see his brother. The black SUV carrying the governor of the state slipped into a service entrance at the back of Northgate Public Hospital, away from the main entrance and prying eyes. Marcus Donovan stepped out, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He was met by a visibly flustered hospital CEO and a composed, almost preening Karen Vance, who clearly saw this crisis as an opportunity. "Governor Donovan," Vance began, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "On behalf of the entire Northgate family, we are so terribly sorry for your situation. We want to assure you that we have been providing the very best possible care for the patient." She didn't call him Michael. She called him the patient. "However," Vance continued, steering him down the hallway, "I must inform you of an unfortunate incident. There was a rogue nurse on staff who has since been terminated. She took it upon herself to administer an unauthorized, dangerous substance to your brother, which has significantly complicated his care." Marcus stopped walking. He turned to face her, his eyes like chips of ice. Vance's words were a self-serving poison. She was framing the hospital as the victim and some anonymous nurse as the villain, all before he had even laid eyes on the brother he hadn't seen in 15 years. "Take me to his room," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The room was at the very end of the hall, the forgotten territory. The air inside was heavy with the scent of sickness. And there, in the bed, was a man who was both a stranger and as familiar to him as his own reflection. The fiery red hair was gone, replaced by a few thin, white strands on a pale scalp. The muscular frame was wasted away. But the shape of the face, the line of the jaw, it was Mikey. The governor's polished facade, the one he had spent a lifetime constructing, disintegrated. He walked to the bedside, a wave of guilt so profound it almost buckled his knees. 15 years of searching, of wondering, of regret, crashed down on him in this sterile, bleak room. His brother's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with medication and pain, but they focused on him. A flicker of recognition. Then the old, familiar fire sparked just for a second. A sneer, weak but unmistakable, crossed Mikey's lips. "Marcus," the voice was a dry, rattling whisper, "came to see the show? A little late for the last act." And then his eyes drifted shut as another wave of pain, a deep, shuddering tremor, seized his frail body. Marcus stared, his heart breaking. He had found him. He had found him, only to watch him suffer. He turned to Karen Vance, who was hovering in the doorway, her face a mask of professional concern. But Marcus saw through it. He saw the calculation. "You told me he was getting the best care," Marcus said, his voice trembling with a barely controlled fury. "This is not the best care. This is torture." He took a breath, his gaze hardening. "The nurse. The one you fired. The rogue one. I want to know everything about her now." The story, when it broke, was an explosion. A low-level clerk in the hospital's billing department who had a cousin who worked for a local news blogger made a phone call. The headline was pure dynamite. "Governor's missing brother found dying in public hospital. Nurse fired for trying to ease his pain." Overnight, Sarah Jenkins' quiet, desperate life was thrown into the crucible of a 24-hour news cycle. News vans camped outside her apartment building like vultures. Her face, a worried, tired photo from her nursing school ID, was plastered across every television screen and news website. She became a symbol, a flashpoint for a public hungry for a story of heroes and villains. The narrative split instantly. To half the world, she was the Nightingale nurse, a compassionate warrior who defied a heartless system. Stand with Sarah trended on social media. A GoFundMe for her legal defense, started by an anonymous user who was actually Maria Rodriguez, exploded with small donations from strangers across the country. Nurses, teachers, and factory workers saw in her a reflection of their own struggles against uncaring bureaucracies. To the other half, she was a reckless criminal. Medical pundits and legal experts appeared on cable news to pontificate about the catastrophic dangers of her actions. She had violated her oath, broken federal law, and endangered a patient. Karen Vance and Dr. Finch, masters of self-preservation, gave carefully worded, somber interviews. "Our primary responsibility is and always will be patient safety," Dr. Finch said to a reporter, his face a mask of grave concern. "When a nurse goes rogue and administers an unknown substance, they are not just breaking protocol, they are gambling with a person's life. It's a tragedy all around." Sarah watched it all from her couch, feeling like she was dissociating from her own life. This person they were talking about, this angel, this monster, it wasn't her. She was just a nurse who hadn't been able to watch a man scream. In the hospital, Marcus Donovan had created his own gravity. He had his brother Michael move to a private suite on the top floor, a world away from the ward downstairs. He flew in the best palliative care specialists in the country. They took one look at Michael's case and immediately prescribed a powerful, continuous drip fentanyl regimen, supplemented by transdermal patches for breakthrough pain. The exact same medication Sarah had used. The bitter irony was not lost on Marcus. He wielded his power like a weapon. He demanded Sarah Jenkins' entire file, her impeccable performance reviews, the glowing letters from former patients, the single black mark of her suspension. He read the details of Karen Vance's internal investigation, his anger growing with every cold, jargon-filled sentence. He requested the full police report and then did something highly unorthodox. He called Detective Miller directly. Miller, to his credit, was unfazed. He gave the governor a straight assessment. "She's not a hardened criminal, Governor. She's a good person who made a bad decision for what she felt were the right reasons. She saw a guy in pain and broke the rules to help him. In my line of work, I see people break the rules for a lot worse reasons." That night, Marcus sat by his brother's bedside. Michael was sedated now, his face finally peaceful. The lines of agony had been erased by the very medicine that had cost Sarah her career. Marcus looked at his brother, this ghost from his past, and felt the foundations of his own life shift. For 15 years, he had been Governor Donovan, a man of laws, systems, and political calculations. But in this room, he was just Marcus, the brother who had arrived too late. His wife, Jessica, sat with him, her hand on his arm. "The hospital board, your advisors, they all think you should condemn her publicly," she said softly. "It's the politically safe move. It distances you from the scandal." Marcus looked from his brother's sleeping face to his wife's worried one. "For 15 years, I used all the power and money I have to find him, and I failed. This nurse, Sarah Jenkins, with nothing but a paycheck and the memory of her father's suffering, she didn't fail. She didn't see a homeless man, a liability, a problem to be managed. She saw a person, she saw him, and she did the one thing he needed. She gave him comfort." He stood up, a decision hardening in his eyes. "Politics be damned," he said, his voice thick with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "What's right? For the first time in a long time, Jessica, I think I know." He called the meeting for the following afternoon in a sterile conference room at the hospital that felt more like an arena. He had summoned them all, Karen Vance and the hospital's CEO, a nervous, sweating man named Peterson, Dr. Alistair Finch, and Sarah Jenkins, accompanied by her stunned legal aid lawyer who couldn't believe he was in a room with the governor. Sarah felt small, a mouse brought before a council of lions. Vance and Finch began, offering their oleaginous condolences to the governor, before immediately pivoting to their well-rehearsed defense. "Governor, our only priority was and is patient safety," Vance said, her tone smooth and reasonable. "Miss Jenkins's emotional response, while perhaps well-intentioned, was a catastrophic breach of protocol and federal law. She—" "Enough," Marcus said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. The air crackled. He turned his chair slightly, his entire focus landing on Sarah. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "forget them. Forget the cameras and the lawyers. Look at me and tell me why you did it." Sarah took a breath. She looked past the powerful governor and saw a grieving brother, and she told him the truth. She spoke of her father, of his pain, of the dignity the patch had afforded him. She spoke of watching Michael suffer, of the cold indifference of the system, of the maddening helplessness she felt. She didn't make excuses or beg for forgiveness. She simply laid her heart bare. "I knew it was against the rules," she finished, her voice shaking but clear. "I knew I could lose my job, my license. But I'm a nurse. I took an oath to do no harm, and standing by and watching a man be needlessly tortured, that felt like the greatest harm of all. Your brother, Michael, he deserved dignity. That's all I wanted to give him." The room was silent. Dr. Finch broke it with a contemptuous scoff. "Dignity. Sentiment doesn't write prescriptions, Miss Jenkins, and it certainly doesn't absolve one of medical malpractice." That was the spark that ignited the governor's fury. He spun in his chair to face Finch, his face a mask of thunder. "Sentiment?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the walls. "My brother lay in a bed in your ward for 2 weeks, and you and your protocols let him suffer in agony. He wasn't a person to you, he was a chart to be managed. His pain was an inconsistency. His humanity was a liability." He stood up, his towering presence dominating the room. "You had the resources, the knowledge, and the sworn duty to help him, and you did nothing. You hid behind your formulary and your fear of lawsuits." He pointed a finger at Sarah. "This nurse, this woman you threw out like trash, she had everything to lose, her job, her future, her freedom, and she did something. She risked it all to do the one thing you were supposed to do. She showed compassion. She acted like a human being." He turned his gaze on Vance and the pale-faced CEO. "So, here is what is going to happen. The state of New York will not be pressing any charges against Ms. Jenkins. In fact, my personal legal team will be representing her, pro bono, in any federal inquiry that may arise. Furthermore, I am announcing the formation of a governor's task force to conduct a full top-to-bottom investigation into the palliative care practices and funding of every public hospital in this state, starting with this one." He looked directly at Karen Vance, his eyes burning with cold fire. "Your services as head of risk management are no longer required here. Consider this your termination." Then he turned to Finch. "And doctor, I strongly suggest you start remembering that your patients are people, not diseases. Because the state board will be reviewing your license, and I will be taking a very personal interest in their findings." Vance and Finch sat there, stunned into silence, their careers and reputations crumbling around them in real time. The CEO sputtered, trying to object, but the governor waved him into silence. Sarah just sat there, frozen, as tears she didn't even know she was holding back began to stream down her face. They weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of shock, of vindication, of a pressure so immense it had nearly crushed her, finally being released. In the sterile, cold conference room, a quiet, fierce justice had finally been served. A week later, Michael Donovan died. He didn't die in the anonymous misery of the ward, but in the quiet, sunlit peace of the private suite, his brother holding his hand. The end was peaceful. Before he slipped away, he had a few hours of lucidity, a final gift from the medicine that had caused such a firestorm. He and Marcus didn't try to fix 15 years of anger and misunderstanding. There wasn't time. But they found a fragile, essential grace. They spoke of their childhood, of their mother's terrible cooking, of the time they stole their father's boat for a joyride. Forgiveness wasn't spoken, but it settled in the space between them. In one of his last coherent moments, Michael looked at his brother. "The girl," he rasped. "The nurse with the sad eyes. The kind ones. She was here first." "I know, Mikey," Marcus said, his voice thick. Tell her she was an angel. She saw me when no one else was looking." Marcus invited Sarah to the small, private funeral. She stood in the back, feeling like an intruder, until the governor sought her out after the service. He looked older, the weight of his office replaced by the more profound weight of grief. He handed her a sealed envelope. "This is from Mikey," he said simply. "He wanted you to have it." He paused, looking out over the manicured cemetery lawn. I'm starting a foundation in his name, the Michael Donovan Foundation for Compassionate Care. It's going to be dedicated to funding and reforming palliative services in underfunded public hospitals across the state, to make sure no one else has to go through what he did. He met her eyes. Once your legal issues are settled, I'd be honored if you would consider a position on its advisory board. We need people who understand what's really at stake. With the governor's formidable legal team behind her, the case against Sarah evaporated. The federal prosecutors, facing a public relations nightmare and intense political pressure, reduced the charges to a minor regulatory infraction, which was settled with a fine that the governor paid personally. The State Board of Nursing, after a hearing that was more of a formality, issued a formal reprimand and a 6-month suspension of her license, a necessary, realistic consequence for her breach of protocol. But in an unprecedented move, the official letter also included a commendation for her extraordinary and courageous display of patient-centered compassion. The GoFundMe, which had swelled to a staggering amount, covered her rent and living expenses during the suspension. Karen Vance was fired and discovered that her reputation for cold-hearted litigation phobia had made her unemployable in the healthcare sector. Dr. Finch was forced to take an extended leave of absence and enroll in a series of mandatory ethics and sensitivity training courses, a deep humiliation for a man of his ego. The system had been shaken. One quiet afternoon, Sarah finally opened the letter from Michael. Inside was not a letter, but a charcoal sketch, drawn on a piece of hospital stationery. It was a drawing of her, not as a nurse in scrubs, but as he must have seen her face illuminated by the dim light of the ward, her expression one of fierce concentration and kindness. On the bottom, in a shaky hand, were 5 words. You saw me. Thank you. 6 months later, spring had arrived, chasing the last of the Northgate chill away. Sarah's suspension was over. Her license was reinstated. She had offers from several hospitals, her notoriety making her an attractive, if controversial, hire. But the thought of returning to that same environment, the same battles, left her feeling hollow. Then an offer came from a place she hadn't considered. The Northgate Hospice Center, a standalone facility on the edge of town. A place dedicated solely to the art of dying well. The director told her on the phone, "We read your story, Ms. Jenkins. We don't see a rule breaker. We see a nurse who understands our mission in her bones." The final scene is not one of grand victory, but of quiet purpose. Sarah Jenkins, no longer looking over her shoulder, walks through the front doors of the hospice. The air here is different. It's calm, filled with natural light, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with coffee. There are no frantic beeps, no shouting down hallways. She's led to a room where an elderly woman is propped up in bed, her face a mask of chronic pain. Sarah pulls up a chair. She takes the woman's thin, cold hand in her own. "Hello," she says, her voice soft and confident. "My name is Sarah. I'm your nurse." She gives the woman's hand a gentle squeeze, her eyes full of a warmth that is no longer tinged with sadness or fear. "Tell me how I can help." Ah! She had been through the fire and she had not burned out. She had emerged stronger, calmer, and with a purpose as clear and bright as the spring sunlight pouring through the window. Her quiet act of defiance hadn't just saved one man's dignity. It had ignited a fire that had warmed a cold system, and in doing so, it had illuminated her own path forward.